Welcome to Rick Rack Ruby. I'm Laura Cluvo. Today we will be making the last design in the Pixie Noel collection. It's a gift sack and it's fun and easy, so let's get started. To make the gift sack, I'm going to begin with this fussy cut image from the Pixie Noel collection. This is 4.5 wide and 3.5 tall. So the first thing I want to do is stitch the top and the bottom. The bottom is 4.5 by 3 and the top is 4.5 by 5.5. I'll say it one more time. 4.5 by 3.5, 4.5 by 3, 4.5 by 5.5. I'm just going to place them right sides together, 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then the same thing here, 1/4 inch seam allowance. It's going to be a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I don't have a lot of space at the top and the bottom, so it'll be a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I should say that while I started with fat quarters of these fabrics, I found myself reaching for this one all the time, so I bought myself an extra yard. Anyway, now I'll press these seam allowance toward the red, and then I'll come back and run a decorative stitch. I like that triple zigzag along the top and the bottom. I'm using white thread for this entire project. Here we go, and now I'm going to stitch the sides to the center here. I can see that this is a little wonky, but I think it's going to be okay. And this one, yeah, that's going to be okay. So I will stitch these to the sides of the center panel, and then again press the seam allowance to the sides and add the decorative stitch. We have the sides and the decorative stitches, and I did take a little, it was just little bits off the top to sort of true it up. And now before I go on to actually make this into a sack, I want to measure it. This is 16 3/4 by 11. So 11 by 16 3/4. Okay, I'm going to have to write that down. So now to make this into a sack, the first thing that I want to do is sew up this back seam. So just fold the sides together and stitch that with a 1/4 inch. Here we go, and now I'm going to go over to my ironing board and open up this seam and press it flat. There we go, and now I'm going to stitch straight across the bottom. Try to keep this centered. I guess I could measure it, right? Let's see. This is about 1 3/4. And this is maybe a tiny bit more, but I think we're okay. So I'm going to stitch straight across the bottom with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I think I'll put this side up so that I can make sure that the seam stays open. And now we'll create the bottom corners. So the first thing I want to do is just snip the edge. The edge, that's not really the right word. Stitch the seam allowance like that. See, I cut the edge of the seam allowance. I did not cut the seam. And then I'm sort of opening this flat. This is kind of how a lunch bag is made, right? And I just sort of want to make sure that this seam here is perpendicular to this seam. And I'm forming a triangle, and then I'm going to open up this seam allowance and pin it. And then I'm going to sew 3/4 inch from the point. So there's the 3/4 inch, so right there. Well, I guess I'll just use my pens. So about right there. And then the same thing on the other side, but I'll do the first one, then I'll come back and show you how it looks. There we go, that's how it looks. And then I'm just going to trim this off. about 1/4 inch out from the seam. So there is one corner of the bag. And now let's do the same thing for the other one. I'll be a little bit more, I guess, more careful with this one. And so I can really show you how to do it. Okay, so first you're going to cut straight down into the seam allowance to open it up. And then go inside and separate the, what is this, the back from the front. Pull it nice and tight so that you get a triangle there. Try to get the seam allowance right in the center of the triangle like this. I'm a pinner, so I'm going to pin this, but if you want to use a clip or if you just want to wing it, that's fine. I'm going to come 3/4 inch down from the point of the triangle and stitch straight across. To be honest, I have a 3/4 marking on my machine, so I don't actually mark it physically. I just use the indication on my the bed of my machine. But it's kind of right about there where the pin went through. So I'm going to go straight across. I actually go back and forth. So I go, you know, forward and then back. There we go. That's a little bit easier to see than the first side. Boom, boom. And then I'm going to trim this away. Great. So if I turn this right side out, you can see that I have the shape of a sack. Looks good. Now let's make the lining. I decided to go with this fabric for the lining, so I'll begin by sewing up the short sides like this. Now I'm going to center the seam and press the seam allowance open. I think it's important to say that I don't press this part, just the center. So I put my iron carefully right up the middle without, you know, creasing these sides. There we go, there's the seam. The purple line is from when I was just drawing out the rectangle with my disappearing marker. I'm just gonna make sure this is about the same size, and this is centered. So now I'm going to sew the bottom. Either edge can be the bottom when your fabric is non-directional, but if your fabric has direction, then you just wanna make sure you're sewing the bottoms. So to sew up the bottom, I'm gonna leave an opening for turning. Probably from here to here. Give yourself enough room. Don't make it hard to turn. This is going to be inside, way in the bottom. No one's going to see it. So go ahead and leave it big enough for your hand to get through. Here we go. Here's the opening in the bottom. Of course, I back stitched here and here. And now we're going to box out those corners again, just like we did for the outside of the bag. So I'll snip down into the seam allowance. I have a little cup of water. It kind of helps me to roll the edges sometimes. Open out that seam allowance, and then 3/4 inch from the tip, I'm just going to sew right across. I want to make sure this is pretty well centered. Should I measure? Let's see. Okay. That's perfect. Okay, so that's right in the middle. There's 3/4 inch on this side and 3/4 inch on that side. So I'm good to go. I'm going to use a pin and then stitch 3/4 inch from the top right across. There we go. And now I'm going to cut off the corner. And then I'll repeat for this side. There we go. And then trim that off. Now I'm going to put the bag inside the lining, right sides together, the seam in the lining at the center back. There's really no side seams. Line up the back like this, and then it seems to be fitting in there just perfectly. So I'm going to sew around the top. I like to do it this way so that the needle's going like this and working along the inside. There we go, this is all sewed around the top. And now I'm going to reach in through the bottom of the lining and turn this to the right side. That looks good. There we go, there's my nice corners. They look good. These look good. All right, so I'm just gonna go ahead and top stitch this opening closed. So in other words, I have my seam allowances folded in like this. And I'm just gonna pin it and top stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from that folded edge. There's my top stitching. It's a miracle. It actually went through to both sides. And so I will tuck the lining down inside the bag. I'm reaching down into the corners. And now just to make sure I have this nice and straight with, you know, the seam exactly in the center between the blue and the red, I am going to just sort of moisten my fingers and roll that. We're going to top stitch this, so I want to have it just right, and I'm also going to pin it. See, this is what I don't want, where there's like a little dip there, and then if I just went like that, it wouldn't be quite right. So I like to kind of roll it, pinch it, to get that seam right on the edge. That's better. I know it's hard to see, but I hope I'm describing it for you. That looks good. So now I'm going to top stitch 1/4 of an inch from that top edge. Because I'm using a contrast thread, that is just white against the red, I try to keep nice and even and straight stitches on that part. Now we'll make the casing for the drawstrings. The first row of stitches is 2 inches down from the top. So I have a little indication on my machine, and I'm just going to sew all the way around 2 inches from the top. There we go, that looks good. And now I'm going to add a second row 1/2 inch below the first row. The casing is complete, and now we're going to work the drawstring through the casing. I'm going to cut off about 1 yard of baker's twine, and then I'm going to use this. I call it a bodkin, but it's actually a loop turner. I placed the baker's twine in the tight top of the groove there, it holds a little bit more securely. And then I cut a little hole in the casing right on each side. I started it with my seam ripper. I put my finger under here to make sure that I'm not cutting through both layers. You only need 1 layer. And I cut through both sides. Then I'm going to send the bodkin or loop turner all the way through. We're going to take a little break right here on this side, but we're not done. So I'm going to reinsert in that same hole and then go all the way to the original side where we started. That looks good. Okay, then without pulling it at all, I just like to keep the drawstring the height of the bag. So when it stands up, this doesn't drag on the ground or anything. Then the second piece comes from the other side. Same idea, we're going to use about 1 yard of twine and then sort of, you know, thread it through here and then lock it. And then the side, we're going to insert it in the opposite side. And go through here, take a little break, and then back through. And so anyway, then now this is on the other side, right? And so without pulling it tight at all, I just want to make sure that this is going to be just about to the bottom of the bag. Now I have a dry cleaner bag that I'm going to use to stuff this and stand it up for you, but for now I just want you to see how satisfying it is to pull that drawstring. It just stays because the channel is tight and the twine is not slippery like some twine. You don't have to tie it, or I mean, of course you might want to tie it decoratively, but it'll stay closed. Anyway, we are done. So I'm going to make a beauty shot of this bag and then I'll have my conclusion. I also made a second sack with the little elf on the, is that a tree trunk? Yeah. She's very similar. The technique is completely the same, except that her starting square is just 3 by 3. Thank you for watching my tutorial. If you're enjoying my videos, please like, share, and subscribe.